Hello and welcome to our next panel. I'm Andrew Palmer, the executive editor of The Economist, and we're now going to be discussing the topic of psychological safety, which often comes top of the list of things that improve team building and corporate performance. I'm delighted to be joined by four excellent panelists for this session. Adriana Roche is the Chief People Officer for Mural. Jamie Broadley is the Group Head of Health and Wellbeing for Serco. Devyani is the Chief Executive for the HR Tech Partnership, and Jo Lawn-Victor is the Chief International Officer for Headspace. Thank you all for joining us. And I think we might start with a definition, so we're all on the same page. And Adriana, I'm going to come to you first, if I may. Put on the spot and asked to define what psychological safety is. How would you answer?
Sure, and I'm happy to, because I know it can feel a little bit clinical. But really, the concept is relatively simple. It's one where you feel comfortable speaking your mind, sharing your ideas, taking risk at work without any sort of repercussion. And I believe there was a study that was done by Google that shows that psychological safety is really one of those predictors where high-performing teams do really well if they have this. So it's actually a really important thing to have.
Okay, Jamie, anything you'd add to that definition of Adriana's?
Yeah, I think that's a great starting point, a great definition from Adriana. And for me, it's all about just simplifying it down. I think psychological safety has become one of those buzzwords in recent months, much like resilience was probably a couple of years ago, where kind of us corporate types can talk about it, but for colleagues that are at the front line of our businesses, it doesn't necessarily have that same meaning. So for me, it's very much just kind of, do I feel seen when I'm at work? Do I feel understood? Do I feel comfortable to be able to raise a challenge, to have an honest conversation with my line manager? If I see something going wrong or I've seen an incident, I feel comfortable to report it, and do I trust that something will be done off the back of it? So I think it's one of those things that we are measuring already in lots of ways, and I'm sure many employee surveys will be ticking a lot of the boxes that I've mentioned there. And it's just wrapping those concepts together into one nice, neat phrase that we can all talk about on webinars like this.
Devyani, can I ask you whether you think that awareness of and importance of psychological safety has increased as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think when I was listening to Adriana and Jamie, I think what is running through my mind is it's really about trust. It is to feel trusted, and it's to trust, both your team, your leaders. There's no doubt, I think, the level of uncertainty over especially the last couple of years, and the fact that people are physically not together is making this issue far more important and relevant as it was. I mean, there's no doubt that mental health is under strain, and when you really are not touching, when I say touching, it's not literally, but you're not sitting with your team, you're not being able to read the nonverbal signs. I think the feeling of feeling safe, secure, being trusted can get more challenging.
And Jo Lawn, to bring you in, I think I probably would have defined it, at least pre-pandemic, psychological safety, that is, as kind of being happy to challenge your line manager or your superior in a hierarchical structure. I suspect that you would define this slightly differently, given coming from Headspace. Is that right?
Yes, well, it's a lot of the things that everyone mentioned, and I'd say coming from, a woman of color's perspective, belonging is a huge piece of psychological safety. So when I show up at work, are there assumptions being made that really have nothing to do or completely have to do with who I am? And taking the time to understand who is on your team and what makes people feel like they not only have a seat at the table, but you're encouraging their inputs and their thoughts and their ideas to be actioned and to be heard. And I think that takes a very deliberate action for managers to go out and beyond to understand who's on their team and what's important to them, and what can you do to make all of your team members feel like you designed this team for them to be at the table.
So there's a fair degree of consensus here around how to define it. It's quite a broad concept, though. So I'd be interested to know how and if one measures psychological safety. So within your organizations, how do you track it? You can all define it, but how do you track it, if at all? And I'll come back to you, Adriana, and then I'll ask Jolene to come in.
Sure. I would say there's a number of ways in which we're trying to track it, and I think all of us are trying to grapple with how do we actually track this. But for us, there's a few channels. One of them is through our engagement surveys. We ask a few questions around how comfortable do I feel taking risk at the organization, or how comfortable do I feel expressing my opinions. So we ask very pointed questions around the different aspects that we believe define psychological safety. And then we look at them in demographics to see if they look differently for the different demographics. Another way in which we look at this is through our own tool, which is really cool. It's a digital whiteboard, and one of the things that we measure is how much are people collaborating with each other. We can see if the marketing team is collaborating with the sales team, or the product team and the engineering team are collaborating. This gives us a little bit of an insight too into how people are working with each other, and whether we're creating that collaborative environment that we want to have, which is ultimately the result of good psychological safety.
Jolene, is surveys, is that the way that you're measuring this?
Yeah, I think there's two ways that we do it at Headspace. There's formal and informal. So formally, in engagement, we've created a manager score that looks at questions like employee would answer, does my manager have my well-being? Does my manager care about my well-being? And so those are the type of indicators that we look at to say what psychological safety formally. Informally, it comes down to, do you see people challenging ideas at work? When you host a town hall or an all hands, do people ask anonymous questions, or are individuals comfortable to ask a really tough, challenging question publicly because that they know that there will be no repercussions for challenging the status quo or raising the bar for what expectations look like? And so those are I think the most important ways is what's the behavior that you see day to day.
Just take us through, I'm sure you've been in town hall meetings or meetings where no one has spoken, or it has been anonymous. It's been a sort of difficult, passive kind of session. What's the action that you would then take on the back of that?
Yeah, well, we've experimented with anonymous and direct questions. And what we do when we do have the open forum and folks do ask tough questions is it's 100% celebrated. And there's a follow-up with a clear action plan so that the organization can see that feedback was accepted and heard and actioned. And so I think you have to disproportionately celebrate the behavior that you want to amplify across the org, where it might not even feel appropriate, where you say, but you know what, we want this to be modeled. And so we make it a point to, initially at some of our town halls, we would answer every single question that came in anonymously via a Word document to the org so that people knew that every single question mattered and we wanted your voice to be heard.
Jamie, let's come back to monitoring. Do you monitor at Serco, and do you have a target?
Yeah, so we don't have official targets as such yet, because I think we're still in the early days of understanding the metrics that sit behind this, as other panelists have done a great job of describing. So I think I'd add in that we look at this from a kind of a macro and a micro perspective. So from the macro, looking at some of our existing metrics beyond what we've discussed here already, like Serco, we've obviously got strong safety cultures because of the nature of the work that we're doing. So we'll look at safety reporting as a really good, well-established metric that we've got great baselines for, and we can then compare and contrast and see, well, actually, if we've got, say, 6 prisons, for example, and there's some anomalies around, well, there isn't some reporting happening in one of those, then that's going to be an indication as to the culture that's happening there. So we can then go and we can dive into that, and we can start looking into the micro. And examples of that, I think we've touched on this a little bit already with the town hall example there. That if we've got a team and their manager in a room, whether virtual or in person, are that team speaking out? Are they raising difficult things? Do they feel comfortable to do that? Or does it feel suppressed? And it's difficult to add metrics and numbers around that sometimes, other than potentially comments in Teams chats. But that's a really strong indicator as to where that culture sits. And I think Jolene's point there about we need to not just create a space where people can say something and raise something, but we then need to celebrate, and we need to give that positive feedback on the back end of it to encourage more and more of it.
That makes sense. Devyani, from your perspective, are there obvious signals of a culture of non-safety?
Yeah, so I think, both drawing on my previous experience as a FTSE CHRO and now what we do, just to explain, we help organizations use AI digital solutions for many of these issues. And the one thing I would say is, where I'm seeing really innovative organizations or forward-looking organizations focus on is not wait to ask employees. That's great. Asking for feedback is good, but ideally, if you have ways and means of picking up feedback of this kind, whether it's on culture, whether it's on engagement, without going to employees, that's what good organizations are doing. And what I'm seeing is several different ways of doing it. So the first is there's a lot of data, digital data now available because Teams, all of us use email, Slack, lots of electronic means. And if there's a way to glean that data and through that understand issues of collaboration, teamwork, that gives a very good indication, and you can link it to psychological safety. So that's one way, which is called organization network analysis. But equally, I'm also seeing the emphasis on making sure that the touch point on every aspect of the employee life cycle. So pre-boarding, onboarding, when they're within the organization, offboarding, if there is a way to figure out employee engagement and make sure you're capturing that, then again, you're making sure on an ongoing basis the employee feels safe and secure. So I think, the smart thing now is to make sure that your intelligence is real time, not backward looking, but equally it is non-intrusive. You're not going and asking, but there's ways to get that and figure out is the kind of culture safe environment that you're creating for them.
I'll just ask a question about the potential drawbacks, Devyani, of that kind of monitoring of real-time data. So, I mean, I'm sure we've all been in email threads or on Slack channels where everyone is contributing to no great effect, right? I mean, so, everyone's piling in. It's inefficient. So they may be comfortable, but it doesn't lead to a good business outcome. Well, secondly, you could imagine an environment where people are contributing because they feel they have to. It's another form of peer pressure, if you like, or pressure being put on by managers to be seen to contribute. Are either of those, to your mind, sort of reasonable worries, and how do you get past them?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think they're reasonable worries. The biggest worry is obviously the mistrust people have, and rightfully so, about am I being monitored for the wrong reasons? You if you read in the media, obviously there is rising concern about productivity and even loo breaks being monitored so that people are and all that doesn't really contribute then towards creating a safe environment. So I think the important thing is to make sure that firstly that individuals are not targeted, this data is collective, and you're trying to get a sense of either the teams or specific groups of people but not individuals. But more importantly, is the organization using it for the right things? If, for example, there's a concern, is the organization actually wanting to step in and do something to help, or are they going to penalize people? So again, I go back to the first comment I made about trust. I think trust and communication is vital in the use of many of these solutions, just as it is when you're using a survey or any other means.
Let's talk a little bit about how you all foster this culture of psychological safety. And Jolon, you mentioned the importance of celebrating people when they do speak up, when they do ask questions publicly and challenge publicly. That aside, what else does Headspace do to encourage a culture of psychological safety?
Well, we're in this transition of going back into the office and having a hybrid workforce. And so there's a Brene Brown quote that I love: clear is kind and unclear is unkind. And so imagine it's 5 p.m. on Monday and you get an email from your manager saying, can you send me a performance update? What does that mean, right? Do you want a Word doc? Do you want slides? Do you want 30 pages? Do you want bullets? And so one thing that we're emphasizing is managers having extreme clarity in digital communication. What are the SLAs and when you want people to get back to you? If you get something after 5 p.m., is 8 a.m. the next morning okay? Is noon the next day? And managers really clarifying, I have 3 bullet points that I'd like for you to complete with these numbers being updated is such a gift of kindness that I think managers have to disproportionately invest in right now, because when you get a Slack, you get an email, especially when it's off hours, you're relying on that individual to do the interpretation when that really is the responsibility of the person with the request. So manager communication is job number 1.
Can I just on that ask, is the idea that the connection to psychological safety sort of giving employees the permission to come back to a manager and say, that is an unreasonable set of expectations? Is that the idea behind clarity?
The idea behind clarity is that you know what's expected of you, and then you can achieve to that. So if the bar for success for you is here, and your interpretation of it is here, and maybe you're under or overperforming, I think that's where some of the gaps come in of this place of mistrust, because you don't know what the expectations are. And so it's not just about having a sense of belonging. It's about having clarity of what it is that for you to be successful looks like in the organization.
Jamie, what would you pick out? So good.
So I think it's helpful to frame this in terms of what we're trying to achieve by creating psychological safety and putting some actual goals around that, because it's a broad concept and we can apply it in lots of different directions. So obviously we've got some corporate offices where we're having similar conversations to what it sounds like Jalon's having there, in terms of how do we bring people back into the office in an appropriate way. Psychological safety in that context looks very different to if we went out to one of our environmental services contracts and looked at how we were making sure our bin men were working safely. We want people to challenge in different ways. So understanding that goal at the end of it, I think, is really, really important, and will then dictate a number of the other behaviours which fall out of that, which obviously can get into specifics, but conscious of time for you.
Well, why not give us an example, Jamie, since you've raised it? It'd be interesting to know.
So in terms of the getting back into the office piece, then, so obviously the goal there is to make sure that everyone feels that their voice has been heard. So the methods that we've utilised in that format will be bringing people together both virtually and, where appropriate, for kind of mini internal conferences, doing really high energy kind of whiteboard sessions, bringing loads of ideas in, making sure everyone has got that opportunity to contribute. The barriers to contributing are really low. And then from that, it's that kind of collaboration and co-creation approach to what are the ways that we're going to get back into it, and recognizing that there's a vast kind of dimension of wants and needs within that. That then makes people feel, okay, well, I've been part of this, even if the final outcome isn't necessarily what I was hoping for. I can still see myself in it, and I can understand why we've made those decisions. There's not that gap between, we've done an event and then the decision's been made, but I've not got, to Jalon's point earlier, that clarity in between the two.
Adriana, Jamie's just mentioned whiteboards and collaboration, which must be music to your ears. So what happens at Mural to foster psychological safety?
Absolutely, and that's the beautiful thing about our product is that it really helps out with that. And when we think about building psychological safety at Mural, we think about it in 2 big buckets. One of them is, what are the processes and systems that you're creating to foster psychological safety or a collaborative environment? So, for example, Jalon was talking about, do you get an email at 5 p.m.? What we have done is we have created workshops, which has been really fun because we use our product and a template, and we have a facilitator that guides us through that conversation. And everybody has a chance to have an input, and we can prioritize some of the ideas. So we've come up with a communication charter. And we've done this with a number of things around Mural that are just social contracts that we have with each other. And having this sort of clarity and the contract on what is expected of you kind of eases people's expectations of what they're supposed to be doing. And we actually found that it reduced burnout because folks were not spending time just thinking about, what am I supposed to do here? What's the right way to do that? And even accelerated onboarding. On the other hand, we also think about what are the skills or what are the behaviors that we want managers to bring with them into the conversation. So a lot of that is, how do you teach them to coach rather than direct? And this is all about asking the right questions. So we sit down with them and we give them tools for one-on-ones. Speaking of one-on-ones, we're asking people to bring their whole selves to work, asking, who are you as a human? How was your weekend? Tell me how you're doing during those first 5 minutes of the conversation. And there's a fun exercise that we do before meetings too, where everybody puts in a mural, whether they're red, green, or yellow, kind of like a traffic light. And it means, where's your energy? And we talk about that. And it creates a sense of vulnerability where you're just creating connection through that. And it really is just about this environment of collaboration where we're designing experiences to foster people to bring their whole selves to work.
Devyani, your view on this, and I think you obviously it matters very much that managers are guiding, role modeling, but you've got a lot of managers in large organizations who probably are not used to this, for whom this kind of language is unfamiliar. People of a certain age, perhaps. How do you work with those people?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, Andrew, you're absolutely right. I do think hybrid workplace is great, but it is putting a lot more pressure on what I call as middle managers or first line managers, who typically have larger number of teams, who earlier were used to everyone being together in the office. And organizations typically haven't invested that much money in building up their capabilities. Usually been senior leaders or it's been employees or high potentials, but the traditional middle manager or first line manager probably hasn't received that level of support to enhance their skills. So firstly, I do think organizations have to pay far more attention now towards how are they supporting middle managers and how they're helping them in this challenging kind of environment where they are expected to, I think as Jolan said, give clarity, make sure that the feedback is empathetic, make sure that there is a coaching, mentoring approach. And I think, what Adriana was saying is tools definitely make a difference. You can't just leave them to it and expect them to get on with things and be good at it. So I do think an emphasis on making sure that there are some great tools. I think some AI digital tools which really can be very intuitive, easy to use, but they also do several different things at the same time. So as an example, you have something that helps the managers with the basics one to one, but also performance. Then there'll be resources in there to say how can you conduct the conversation. If they're struggling on a particular topic, again, it'll highlight them and take them where they can get some more inputs, or they could even have a digital coach help them with things. So I do think there is an opportunity here to use and provide tools for middle managers, because without that, the risk is your basic line of defense is getting affected quite badly.
I think I'm going to play the role of dinosaur here, and you can tell me the ways in which I'm wrong. So let's start maybe with Adriana. I might start with you. What's the argument for bringing your whole self to work? You might make the case that actually, there's a professional version of me and there's a personal version of me, and you don't particularly want to see the personal version of me at work because it's a lot less professional. So tell me how to think through the whole self counter argument. Why is that wrong?
Let's see. I guess I would just start with thinking that, or challenging the assumption that your non-work person is less professional. But the truth is that we were expecting employees to not have their personal life bleed into their work life. And what we have realized from the pandemic and social unrest and everything that's going on in the world, that is very hard to do. And when you create an environment where you're not allowed to discuss how you're feeling, how you're doing, you are not creating a sense of vulnerability. So what you're doing is you're just telling employees that they're not allowed to speak their minds, to tell you that they had a tough time at work, to tell you that their kids are homesick. And all of this eventually affects their work. So when you tell people that they're supposed to keep it out of the workforce, you're just missing out, not just on creating empathy and creating psychological safety, but you're also missing out on creating an environment where people will tell you what they're struggling with, both from a personal perspective and a work perspective, so you can help them out, or the organization can help them out.
Okay, Jalon, another version of the dinosaur question, which would be, this all sounds great for employees. How's it going to help my business? And I think probably you have the easiest answer to this of the panelists, because you're selling something in this space. That is your product. But what's the outcome that proves the business value of everything that we've been discussing?
There's this term called presenteeism, where you have employees that come to work, but they're not mentally fit to come to work. And so you might be stressed, you might have anxiety, you might be overwhelmed, and you say, you know what, I'm just going to suck it up and show up, when you really shouldn't. And so that decreases productivity. You have somebody who's unwell, who's poorly, needs to be focused on boundaries or recovery or sleep, or who knows, spending time with their family, seeing their doctor, and they show up to work or interact with a customer, and that does not help anybody all around. And so, at Headspace, we have all different types of ways that we bring in the power of the pause. We have what's called Mind Days, where every fortnight you have a PTO day to yourself, and we alternate those with no meeting Fridays. And so going back to the concept of managers role modeling, when I first started, I didn't realize how serious, the organization was. And here I am sending emails on a Mind Day, and not on the Mind Day, but the next business day, I got a ping of somebody asking me, how did you enjoy your Mind Day? And that was the aha moment for me, that I absolutely have to model this, because I can't set meetings with my team on these days. So going back to answer your question, yes, it hits the bottom line when you have people showing up that aren't fit to show up.
Jamie,
Andrew, can I give
yes,
a very
of course.
live example of leadership that is effective because they're authentic and they're not? So if you look at Putin versus Zelensky, I guess Putin has what we call as the dinosaur style of being a leader. Everything is scripted. There is this I'm in charge. Then there is an element of which is very different to Zelensky's style, which is very authentic. He's in the moment. He's emotional. And you can see the impact it has in terms of the people they are trying to influence. Completely different. And I think while that may be a war situation, I think there are parallels even in an organization.
Thank you. Jamie, on empathy, some people lack it, and they may already be in senior positions. Can it be taught?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think this underpins a lot of what we're discussing here, is that we can give the tools and we can create the opportunities, but it does rely on a human being being human in order to make this really land. So for me, it's about how do we get our leaders and our managers actually role modeling this, and the way to do that is to get them to feel it themselves. And I think often when we push out training or toolbox or things like that, we forget that manager or leader that we're expecting to do that is also in the system themselves. They're also in that hierarchy. They've got a manager, they've got a leader. So we need to start from the top and push this down in order so that people have got the understanding and the kind of the cognitive side of things, but they've also got the emotional side of it. They know what it feels like to have someone reach out and say, how are you really doing? Is there anything going on that we can help with? Do you need a mind day? I think that's a great concept. And only when they've actually started to appreciate the benefits of some of that will then they really be sold on, okay, I'm going to go and have this conversation with my team, and I know why, not just because the organization's required me to. And that's where this stuff really starts landing, and we create positive momentum, I think.
How does, Devyani, I'll come to you again. How does a hybrid world either make this more or less complicated going forward? So in this, a lot of this role modeling, a lot of cultural inculcation that happened in the in the past, in offices, face-to-face, you just observed interactions. Much harder to do that now. So what are the secrets? And again, I don't want this to turn into a product ad for Mural. So apart from whiteboards, what else?
Um, I think, firstly, it's Zoom. Let's not forget that I think Zoom can be far more transparent than often a face-to-face meeting. There's so much more you can often see in a person when they're that close to you. So I do think, however, that digital can be an enabler for people to almost be themselves who they are. And we saw that in the pandemic when you had senior leaders sitting in their living rooms on the sofas, and in a way that kind of informality, the trend had already started. But I think social media is also helping in a big way. It's no longer is enough to do formal kind of town halls and speeches, but I think good leaders are using LinkedIn, they're using posts, they're using a whole range of social media to bring themselves in, make communication far more informal. So yes, I think a hybrid work, there's two sides to the coin. It can feel a little more challenging, but it can also, I think it's also enabling right now for people to just be far more authentic than they've been.
Adriana.
Yes, I think the benefit of the pandemic has been that it has made us question what worked and what didn't work. And a lot of us are trying to figure out whether we're going back to the office, we're hybrid, we're fully distributed, but we're all grappling with what are the things that we need to do to move forward and what have we learned during the pandemic. And the truth is, like, the way in which we were doing it before was really not working. Decisions were being made in the hallway, and then people were getting left out of the conversation. I went to so many meetings where we had these discussions and we would come out and I would feel, well, I didn't hear from so-and-so, and what was actually the decision that was made, and was that the right decision? Or I would even go to offsites and the experience wasn't well designed. So you would see the extroverts by the bar talking, the introverts in a corner, and you just missed out so much from that experience. So I guess what I'm trying to say is what we have really learned is that we really need to design the work experiences to make sure that you're getting the most out of it. Whether you're fully in the office or you're fully remote, you really need to think it through. So for example, meetings, it's one of those things where we spend a lot of time in them, and it's not enough to just throw a tool, a Zoom, or a whiteboard, right? How do you design the experience from beginning to end? You decide, is it a decision-making meeting? Is it a brainstorming meeting? Okay, cool. So let me plan that from the beginning. During the meeting, we can pull up a whiteboard or whatever it is that you're using. You have a facilitator that can engage people in a different way. You can put sticky notes or you can prioritize. What's the methodology? What's the process that you're using to make sure you're getting the most out of people? Everybody has a voice, everybody's collaborating. And at the end of the meeting, there needs to be a process afterwards where you're capturing the conversation and capturing the decisions, and you decide how we're going to action on this and communicate it. So end to end, we just need to be thinking about the experience as a whole versus just letting things happen and being much more deliberate.
I want to take the conversation onto the question of the brilliant jerk. So talented employees who clearly help the bottom line of organizations, but are basically really toxic, or even just slightly toxic. What do your organizations do about those kind of people? I'm sure, well, maybe they don't exist, but I suspect they do in every organization. Do you have a no tolerance policy? Is it a case by case? I'm going to come to Jamie, I think, first on this.
Yeah, it's a really, really interesting question, and I kind of wear two hats with this because I've got a bit of a sporting background as well, where the kind of the brilliant jerk is potentially tolerated even more because of the obvious benefits they bring in that arena. For me, I think the question is similar to what we discussed earlier, kind of what we're trying to achieve here. If it's something that's very short term, very performance orientated, and is kind of intense, then you can probably get away with more of that. If it's something which is, this is a team that's delivering stuff that's really depends on customer service, or say it's in healthcare or things where culture is going to have a real bleed over into that end product, then the approach is going to need to be really different. I think ultimately the place that I start from with this is that everyone's behavior makes sense to them. So everyone is being reasonable for the most part in their own mind. So it's about understanding why this behavior is reasonable to that individual. And then from a manager's point of view, that's their job. They've got to get their sleeves rolled up and get in and start working with them. Can their behaviors be moderated to the effect where they're still able to produce an impact for us as a team, but they're not having a negative impact? And that's where we then start getting towards that kind of thick red line of, well, actually, is this the right place or not? And that is obviously, there's a huge amount of variables which go into whether that's a yes or a no at that point.
Joe Lawn, same question to you. I mean, Jamie sort of described that this can be context specific. Is that how you would see things at Headspace?
It depends. If this is an individual that's early career, it might be an opportunity for coaching where this individual just has low self-awareness of the impact of their behavior on the organization. Now, if we're talking about somebody who's been in the workforce for some time and that's just their chosen style of performing, then you have to say, does this behavior align with the values in the organization? And at Headspace, we prioritize values alignment over performance. So if we have a disconnect where there's a clear clash from that, then it's not a fit and it's not going to work for that individual or for the company.
In any circumstances, you might have a star salesperson who is just, brings in way more revenue than anyone else. They've got to go if they're
it's
sufficient.
Toxic for the team. When you reward and celebrate the values misalignment, that speaks louder than any town hall, any words on the wall, any words on the website. You're saying, I accept this, I tolerate it, and I celebrate it. And it means that you're not being honest with the organization, because if you're, on the other hand, saying these other things are important to us and we want to uphold them, then I think you've kind of created that ultimate formula where there isn't psychological safety because you're saying one thing and you're doing another.
Adriana, Devyani, I want to give you a chance to come in on this too. Adriana first.
Yes, I think that this person we're describing is one of the two that I think are difficult to manage. The other one is the really nice person who's very culturally aligned and very nice to people, but that's also underperforming. And when you create environments where there is psychological safety, where people are good at collaborating, you're bringing to the surface these two types of behaviors. And when you're having that continuous feedback, you have the chance to coach folks, to help them change, to develop their abilities, maybe to move to a different role. But ultimately, if that doesn't happen, you do have to exit them from the organization, or they will exit themselves because they won't feel like they're getting aligned. And it's not just that you're not creating psychological safety and you're celebrating, that is happening as well. But your other high performers will either start leaving or they will start acting the same way. So ultimately, it just impact your bottom line as well, and you're not thinking about it in the long term if you don't manage it.
Devyani?
Yeah, we all talk about diversity, and in a way it's become fashionable to talk about it, but really an environment that is probably more diverse has different kinds of people. The risk of this then is less, just because there is, again, a different kind of safety. If you have similar kinds of people, and then some of this behavior is condoned even more just because you're a group. And so it's okay to get away, and it's considered normal then. So for me, this is one more kind of business case as to why do you need a diverse workforce.
One question back to you on your comment about that, the type of the nice underperformer, which is the flip side of the brilliant jerk. Is there any tension here in kind of trying to encourage psychological safety, but also being very clear that you're not good enough, you're out? So presumably the secret here is in how that process is handled. You wouldn't argue against being overly lenient to underperformers from the sound of it.
Right, absolutely. And it's that whole adage with like clear is kind, right? And making sure that you are setting clear expectations from the very get go, that you're having continuous conversations where the manager is being very honest, but in a thoughtful way about what the performance is like. And then the employee as well. We were talking about bringing your whole selves to work. They're feeling comfortable saying either, I'm just not good at this, or I'm not grasping this concept. Or it could be that they're having a real issue of a personal level. So making sure that you're having those honest conversations is so, so, so important to helping this person out. And I've had many situations where I've coached managers at Mural or any other organization where you have these folks who are very culturally aware and they're a great fit for the culture, but they're not performing for whatever reason. And they've been grateful because the conversations that we've had made them realize, you care about me as a person. Maybe this company is no longer for me, or maybe this role is not the right one for me. And then they exit feeling like they were treated like a human being. So it is really important to have those conversations with anyone.
Jalon, I just want to take us back before people join the workforce. So during recruitment, which, for some people at least is an exercise in pretending. I mean, you're trying to sell yourself at some level. How do you kind of foster and signal and test whether people are going to be the right fit? And again, and you signal as an organization to people who are looking at you as candidates that you want people who will challenge, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you break down that slightly artificial environment that an interview is?
Yeah, well, I think the biggest thing that you can do is give the individual the task of similar to what their job is going to be. So whether that's a case study where you get to see how somebody thinks, where you get to ask them questions, because a great interview candidate will have perfectly rehearsed answers to all of the right expected questions, but understanding how somebody thinks, how they process information, how they digest it and come back with clarifying questions, that's where you get to see the brain in action. And so as much as possible, if you can have some type of case or craft presentation, that is the best known indicator. And I say to all of the hiring managers on my team, you should be bright green about every single candidate that you extend an offer to. Not, lime green, not amber, because everybody has development opportunities that will be highlighted and magnified once you're in the role. And so if you have, a little, your gut is telling you, there's something here, I always find that gets amplified once the candidate is in role. So put people through, the rigor, and then feel really confident that that's the best person for the role.
We are approaching the end of the session, unfortunately. So what I want to do is ask each of you in turn just to show a little vulnerability and tell me what's the thing that you struggle with most in this area. You're all trying to foster this culture within your organizations. What's the thing that you find hardest as you go about it? And I'm going to go in the order we started with. So Adriana, I'm going to come to you first.
Oh gosh, I would say the world is a tough place right now, and employees are really struggling, whether it's because of the continuous pandemic, social unrest, a war that is starting, whatever it is that is happening. And they're being vulnerable, and we're asking them to be vulnerable and to bring their whole selves at work to work. And the part that I struggle with the most is that I also need to put my own oxygen mask first, and I also need to show some sort of vulnerability, not just because I need to role model it, but for my own mental health. And it's that balancing act, right? Of like, how much do you show the vulnerability, but how much do you show up as a strength and a pillar for an organization for people who are going through tough times? So that is definitely something that I'm still learning to balance and to work through in my role, because I guess we've been privileged enough to be put in a position where we need to help people go through this.
Okay, thank you. Jamie.
Yeah, so kind of copy and paste on Adriana there. I think she's nailed that answer for me as well. So I think when you're in well-being style roles, the kind of the pressure is there you have to hold the space for people, and you have to kind of create that feeling of psychological safety in order to encourage others to share themselves. And that then creates a bit of a tension as to how much of myself I can bring into that space to make sure it's not dominating it or setting an energy in a certain direction. So knowing how much of the mask that you can take off when it is one of those harder days, that's always going to be a line to tread. And I think the thing that I've learned is if I can't do that as much because of whatever reason, then I still need to take that mask off at some stage that day and make sure that there's that kind of debrief process and all the other good stuff that comes with that. So yeah, very similar to Adriana in that front. I really hear that.
Devyani?
I think for me, it's about, personally, it is about showing compassion to the extent it's needed. I'm of the generation where, as a woman, as an immigrant, I was in tough international jobs, and you just got on with things. You handle everything, family, work, and so in a way, I guess for me, it's also important to remember that just because I could do it doesn't mean everyone should be able to do it, and it's important to show compassion and be open-minded about things.
Great, thank you. And Jolon, to close.
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest challenge is everybody having the same level of psychological safety on my team. So, if you chat with me day in and day out, there's probably a higher level of trust than those that I maybe have less interactions with. And so how does every single member, even those that I probably have the least amount in common with, have the same sense of psychological safety that maybe my direct team does? And so for me, small things that I do is on Monday mornings, try and Slack, and say hello to the folks that I haven't interacted with fairly often, so that it becomes a comfortable thing to have a conversation, to know that that door is open.
We are unfortunately out of time, but thank you. That was incredibly interesting. You're all very, very thoughtful about this, and we could have kept going. But unfortunately, the schedule is against us, so we have to leave it there. Thank you very much for participating, and I hope you come back.